Pop quiz. Which JoJo character runs away from battle half dead, takes another character's identity, and reintegrates himself into the family of the person whose identity he takes? 10 seconds, time's up, and you're wrong. The answer was Yoshikage Kira. Recently, the Shuckmeister put out a video about JoJolion's protagonist Josuke, also known as Gappy. I really liked that video, and it came at the same time that I was developing my own theories on Gappy and the future of JoJolion. I saw it and immediately thought, this must be the work of gravity, and so decided to put my thoughts into words. This video began as a simple response to Shuckmeister's theory, but it eventually evolved into a more overarching theory on JoJolion's themes and how the part will end. But ultimately, just like Shuckmeister's video, it all comes down to the question of, who is Josuke Higashikata? Two things to note before we begin. First, there will of course be spoilers for JoJolion in this video, so proceed with caution. Second, as of recording this video, the most recent JoJolion chapter was chapter 88, Ojiro Returns Part 2, and as such, nothing past this point will be taken into consideration. JoJolion is still being released, so it might take a dramatic turn into something completely unprecedented. The last few chapters illustrate this point better than anything else I can think of. So without further ado, let's start off with a quick recap of Shuckmeister's theory before we begin dissecting it. If you have yet to see it, I highly recommend checking out the Shuckmeister's video because I'll be referencing it quite a bit here. Link in the description. The gist of the video is that he believes that Giorno Giovanna is actually the original universe inspiration for Gappy. He makes a lot of compelling points regarding the similarities between Gappy and Giorno. I mean, the clothing part seems a bit arbitrary. After all, how many times have we seen characters that share design motifs with their stand? But otherwise, there's still a lot here to consider. Gappy and Giorno are both kind-hearted towards their allies, but they're also especially brutal, and the most likely to kill their enemies of all the JoJos. They both had troubled upbringings. They are the only JoJos who share a musical reference to the same artist, Prince. And finally, they both go up against criminal organizations. But here's where I disagree with Shuckmeister's conclusion. While I believe all these things were intentional decisions made by Araki, I don't think the reason behind them was because he was trying to directly parallel Giorno himself. Instead, I think Giorno's character and Gappy's characters are the same type of stand. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's think of what Giorno is for a second. He is the son of Dio Brando using Jonathan Joestar's body, and as such, he ends up paralleling Dio in many ways, with the primary difference being that he has Jonathan's sense of justice. The reason Gappy shares so many similarities with Giorno is because he follows a similar thesis. If Giorno is what would happen if Dio Brando was a hero, then Gappy is what would happen if Yoshikage Kira was a hero. In fact, in both cases, these characters are literally a product of the villain's body, or their equivalent's body, having been grafted onto the body of a Joestar or Joestar equivalent. I can't think of a more literal metaphor for a villain fulfilling the role of a JoJo than that. Now, some of you may be thinking to yourself, well, that's obvious. Of course he's a heroic version of Kira. It's the first thing we learn in JoJolion when Gappy and Yasuho visit Kira's apartment. But there's a lot more to this than you may think. Because of how that arc is formatted, as well as how the latter arc where Kira and Josuke fight Demo is formatted, we are led to believe that Yoshikage Kira of JoJolion's universe is Kira in name, stand, and a few minor quirks only, and that he, like his sister, is a reimagining of Jotaro first and foremost, with a name that just happens to be lifted from one of the original Morio's inhabitants. Not only that, but Gappy being part Kira tends to get forgotten when we learn about Josuke Kujo, who clearly takes far more inspiration from Gappy's namesake. Araki's depiction of the original Josuke in JoJolion's style shows this best. I think it's about time that we explore in a bit more depth what exactly the implications of Gappy being a heroic reimagining of original Kira are. Let's return to a few of Shuckmeister's examples where we can explore this idea in a bit more depth. To start off, we have how both Giorno and Gappy are incredibly brutal people, caring very little about letting those who stand in their way continue to live. Now, all the JoJo villains are incredibly brutal, but especially so the villains these characters are based on. Dio is no stranger to over-the-top kills, and Kira's primary means of dealing with his enemies is to make them violently explode. But being villainous does not necessarily mean being brutal. As such, making these characters heroic does not outright remove their brutality. It simply focuses upon characters who they deem evil and those who try to harm innocents. Chocolata murders countless people and enjoys it? Straight into the trash. Diavolo sells drugs to children and killed my friends? Straight into the trash. Gappy is the same way. Look at how he murks Demo in broad daylight after he tried to hurt the people who gave him a place to call home. You know who else killed someone in broad daylight? Yoshikage Kira. The main difference? When Kira killed Shigechi, he did it for selfish reasons, against an innocent middle schooler, which made him seem very villainous. When Gappy killed Damo, he did it to protect his family against a proven sadist, which made it feel very justified. Next up is their shared reference to Prince. The songs which their stands reference relate back to the characters they originally take influence from. Gold from Prince's Gold Experience album is about money, but it's also about wanting what others have. Everybody wants to sell what's already been sold, everybody wants to tell what's already been told. If we think back to Dio Brando, you'll recall that his original goal was to claim the Joestar's fortune. Meanwhile, Soft and Wet is about woman and eroticism, but the song includes lines like, "Baby, can you stand the pain? There's so many things that you do to me," and "Every time I'm with you, you just love me to death." These lines are innocuous in the song itself, but they eerily harken back to Yoshikage Kira's sexually motivated homicides when considering the context. In both cases, the song can be interpreted as an upbeat and lighthearted take on the subject of both villains' pursuit, which reflects JoJo and Gappy to a T, and both of them being Prince songs could be interpreted as them being the successor to these characters' legacies. Finally, let's examine how both JoJo and Gappy go up against criminal organizations. The important thing to focus on here, in my opinion, is not the organizations themselves, but what each organization represents. Dio hated the world for dealing him a bad hand. His father was a drunk, he was poor, he wasn't respected, and up until he was adopted by the Joestars, his life was awful. This was the reason behind his villainy. In the same way, life dealt Giorno a pretty awful hand. But Giorno isn't Dio. He doesn't allow that awful hand to define him. Giorno acted proactively against injustice, just as a hero does. His rebellion against Passione is emblematic of that, as he saw injustice in his society, and rather than partake in that injustice, save for the occasional case of petty theft and tourist scamming, he paved the way through it himself. He didn't want to simply join Passione, he wanted to reform it to better represent the kindness shown by the mobster who looked after him. It isn't an accident that Diavolo, who represented that injustice that Giorno sought to overcome, shared such a functionally identical ability with Dio. With Gappy, we have yet to reach the climax of the part, and as such, we'll need to make a few predictions about who exactly Gappy is fighting in order to draw any meaningful conclusions. We'll return to this topic in a bit, but for now, I just want to say that there's some dramatic irony in Gappy fighting against a bunch of doctors when original Kira not only lost to original Josuke, a character whose primary ability allows him to heal, but also because he died to an ambulance running him over. But the similarities between Giorno and Gappy are not what convinced me that Gappy is meant to be a heroic take on Yoshikage Kira. I consider the final nail in the coffin to be how the story of new Yoshikage Kira and original Yoshikage Kira parallel each other exactly. Let's recap, shall we? Yoshikage Kira is living a relatively normal life, but something comes along that upends his peaceful existence and forces him to act. His actions grab the attention of a local group of stand users, and unfortunately, he incurs their wrath. A few members of the group manage to back him into a corner. In an effort to escape, Kira utilizes his sheer heart attack ability and wreaks havoc on his surroundings, jeopardizing the safety of an acquaintance in the process. He manages to escape, bloody and on the verge of death, but by using the power to replace body parts, he leaves behind his prior identity, with only a corpse marking his escape. He takes on a new identity as a member of a local family, successfully throwing the group off his trail, for the time being. Now here's the thing, Kira's story does not end with him managing to escape. All of the events I mentioned were events that took place in the first half of original Kira's story. But, if thus far Araki has reinterpreted the first half of Kira's story, then unless we are given reason to believe otherwise, it can be concluded that JoJolion's climax and resolution will follow the remainder of the event, aka the story of Yoshikage Kira stealing the identity of Kosaku Kawajiri. In fact, I think the events that will mirror Kira's home invasion have already been set into motion, and we can figure out how by asking one simple question. If original Kira's story is reimagined over the remainder of JoJolion, then it is vital that a certain character role be filled. Who is the reimagining of Kosaku Kawajiri, the man that original Kira took the identity of? Gappy didn't take anyone's identity, so how would he be able to recreate the original events in a similar way? Can we even be sure that there is a Kosaku Kawajiri equivalent? After all, we know so little about the original Kosaku Kawajiri besides what is said about him by others. We never even see him as anything but a corpse. All we know is that Kira takes his name, takes his place in the family, he dies, and he's a father. Who else? Oh. Oh. Oh no. And just like that, all of the puzzle pieces begin falling into place. It always did seem odd that Josuke's influence on the JoJolion universe seemed to be so spread out, but I guess now we know why. In the original universe, Kira takes on the appearance of Kosaku Kawajiri in order to replace Kosaku Kawajiri, while in the JoJolion universe, Kira takes on the appearance of Josuke Higashikata in order to replace Josuke Higashikata. We have the same story beats happening in similar ways, but the reason they occur and the context they exist in have been completely changed so that the scenario no longer depicts Kira as a villain. In addition, if Gappy is based on Kira, then of course that'd mean that the family he joins after losing his identity would be based on the Kawajiris. But the big inconsistency here is Gappy replacing Norisuke. Why would Gappy be the one who killed Norisuke? He's done nothing but show him kindness. Is Norisuke even dead either? I mean, this is JoJo we're talking about. Where's the choir of angels and Norisuke's soul rising to heaven? No one dies unceremoniously in JoJo. Unless you're Hot Pants, that is. But that's the thing. Just as Giorno is not Dio, Gappy is not Kira. He's Kira reimagined to be more heroic. As such, we need to consider what Kira's home invasion would be like if reimagined in a heroic light. If Gappy replaces Norisuke, it will likely not be out of a sense of his own self-preservation. Instead, it will be to take on Norisuke's role and responsibility as the head of the Higashikata household. This is what would put Gappy in direct conflict with JoJolion's mysterious main antagonist. Who's that, you might ask? Well, there are a few options. Jobin seems to be who most people think will be the main antagonist, especially after the most recent chapter. His Speed King resembles Killer Queen quite a bit in application, and his motives, ideology, and design all seem like they would make for a really fun main antagonist. But even so, I disagree. The main villains of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure from the very beginning have always been characters whose actions directly prevent the hero from obtaining their goal. Jonathan wants to keep Dio from hurting more people. Joseph wants to not die to poison. Jotaro wants to save his mom. Josuke wants to keep more people in Morio from dying to Kira. Giorno wants to end Passione's drug trafficking. Jolene wants to be free from prison and to save Jotaro. Johnny wants to get his legs fixed. But what about Gappy? Many would claim that his goal is to obtain the Rokakaka to save Holly, but that's more of a short-term goal made in an effort to obtain his long-term goal. What Gappy wants above all else is an identity and people who care about him. And while he's trying to find that through Holly, he's also slowly developing a place as a member of the Higashikatas. Jobin really doesn't take issue with that. He seems to like Gappy, and only ever opposes him when his actions involve the Rokakaka. So while he could potentially become the main antagonist by preventing Gappy from saving Holly, I think that wouldn't really work well for the overarching narrative. The main villain needs to be someone that directly interferes with Gappy developing a place as a Higashikata. Someone that genuinely hates Gappy. Someone like Kato Higashikata. Despite not getting much time in the limelight thus far, Kato has all the makings of a main antagonist. She is revealed immediately after the defeat of Damo, who up until the end of the Vitamin C fight could have been considered the main villain, as he was the boss of the enemy stand users fought in the first half of JoJolion. And when I say immediately after, I mean immediately after. Damo is killed, the Higashikatas are shown to be disturbed by the events that just occurred. Gappy has his revelation. Jobin reacts in disbelief to Gappy killing Damo, and then we jump straight into Kato getting released from prison. That's a mere 4 pages. Kato also has some direct thematic ties to the previous antagonist, Funny Valentine, in that her ability utilizes spatial manipulation, which could be the theme for the new universe's antagonist, just as time manipulation was a theme for the original universe's antagonist. She also has close ties to JoJolion's overarching ideas of motherhood and family. She acts as a matriarchal figure in a story full of characters shaped by their experiences with their mothers, much like how Valentine is a patriarchal figure in a story full of characters shaped by their fathers. But what makes me certain that Kato is going to be the main villain is how perfect a foil she is to highlight Gappy's integration into the Higashikata family. Gappy is not a part of the Higashikata family bloodline. He was adopted into the family by Norisuke. Kato is the same, despite giving birth to all the 5th generation Higashikata children, and yet Kato believes herself to deserve half of the Higashikata household. Certainly more than that upstart Josuke does, that's for sure. But as much as she would hate to hear it, Kato's ties with the Higashikatas is at this point flimsier than Gappy's. Not only did she spend 15 years in jail, and therefore doesn't really have any relationship with any of her children other than Jobin, but Norisuke also divorced Kado, and didn't want her interacting with the rest of the Higashikadas, and all of her children, save for Jobin, feel the same. During chapter 58, Dawn at the Higashikata house, Kado and Holly Joestar Kira are shown as two mothers whose children feel completely different about them. Kado terrifies everyone with her reintroduction, while the idea that Holly is suffering and can't be properly taken care of brings Gappy, someone who doesn't even have any memories of her, to his knees in grief. So in the event that Norisuke dies in a paper cut related accident, then both Gappy and Kado are likely going to be at odds with each other. Both people brought into the family through Norisuke, fighting over who will be the branch grafted to the Higashikata family tree in his place. Wait a minute. Is JoJolion just one big plant analogy? Well, regardless, let's return to what we discussed earlier, and that's how Gappy's story is a heroic reimagining of original Kira's story. If we're going to predict how these events will be reimagined, then we should first get a list going of all the important remaining story arcs that involve Yoshikage Kira. First is the Adam Heartfather arc, where the Dwayne gang investigates Yoshikage Kira's home and find an enemy stand user living there, his father, Yoshihiro Kira. It parallels JoJolion's Soft and Wet arc, where Gappy and Yasuho investigate Yoshikage Kira's apartment and find an enemy stand user living there, his friend, Ojiro Sasame. It explains Ojiro coming back as well, since Kira's father was prevalent across all of the second half of part 4. Ojiro even replicated Yoshihiro's actions in the most recent chapter by secretly leaking information over the phone through Tsurugi, and eventually getting defeated as a result of heat. Perhaps his actions will also lead to Gappy eventually obtaining the Rokakaka, much like how Yoshihiro brought his son the Stand Arrow. Second is the Yoshikage Kira's New Situation arc, a short 2-chapter arc where Kira replaces Kosaku as the head of the Kawajiri household, and we get a sense that life in the Kawajiri home is changing. While short, this arc likely parallels all of the Higashikata family interactions with Gappy that make up most of the early JoJolion arcs. It could also potentially parallel the current arc, but we can't be sure until we know what's going on with Norisuke. Third is the Cat Likes Yoshikage Kira arc, where Kira fights a plant. This could mean anything. Really though, we can already see the influence this arc has had on JoJolion. It's most likely the inspiration for Kira and Josufume's Rokakaka transmutation. Stray Cat was buried, and when they resurfaced, they found that they had undergone a drastic change in appearance and gained a new ability, just as Gappy did. The Stray Cat arc also sets up Killer Queen having a bubble projectile, so the final battle could be a bit more interesting. In JoJolion, Kira and Gappy already have the ability to create explosive bubbles of their own. The ability is integrated into their own stand, so there really isn't a need for a full arc mirroring the Stray Cat fight. It's possible there will be one though. Fourth is the My Dad Is Not My Dad arc and the Another One Bites the Dust arc. In this arc, Kira is backed into a corner by Hayato after he records him committing murder, and as a result kills Hayato in a rage. He immediately regrets doing so, knowing it will lead to him potentially getting discovered, but by developing a new ability, he is able to bring back Hayato. When we reinterpret this in a way where Kira is not the villain, we are left with Kira developing a new ability by saving Hayato from dying. I think you can see where this is going. At some point during the future of JoJolion, Tsurugi will start to become affected by the rock disease, which has been foreshadowed from very early in the part. The disease will start progressing at a ridiculously fast rate, causing much panic. It may happen during a fight or in the midst of the rest of the Higashikadas, but 2 people will definitely be present. Josuke Higashikata and Kado Higashikata, the JoJolion reinterpretations of Yoshikage Kira and Shinobu Kawajiri respectively. It's clear that the plan had always been that Norisuke would sacrifice himself for his grandson to save him from the disease, just as his mother did for him. That's no longer an option though, as Norisuke is currently absent and unable to do anything. As such, it's up to one of the Higashikata family members present to save Tsurugi's life. In the past, Kado was willing to kill Jobin's bully in order to save her son from the rock disease. She maintains that it was the right thing to do, and seeing as the kid tried to force Jobin to kill an innocent girl to save himself, you can see how she's able to justify it to herself and others. However, the situation has changed. There are no homicidal middle schoolers in the immediate vicinity for Kado to sacrifice. The righteous thing? No. The Higashikata thing for her to do in this situation is to sacrifice herself in order to save her grandson. But Kado doesn't look at the world that way. While Norisuke uses the Higashikata family fruit parlor to maintain his family wealth for long after he's gone, Kado only contributes to it because she expects that she'll profit from it in the long term. She definitely cares about her children a lot, but she likely cares about herself even more. As such, she'll search for an alternative. She'll attempt to kill and sacrifice Gappy, who she's already been implied to loathe, to save her grandson. And while she'll likely come close to succeeding, Gappy will ultimately end up saving Tsurugi himself by using the new Rokakaka to transfer the rock disease onto himself. Just as generations of Higashikata family members have done before, just as Josufume did to save Kira, just as Johnny Joestar did to save his son, and just as Jesus Christ did 2,000 years prior. I believe that this is the titular JoJolion, a holy act of self-sacrifice that has the power to transfer disease and misfortune from one entity to another. This act of self-sacrifice marks Gappy's true adoption as a member of the Higashikatas and solidifies that he is Norisuke's replacement, not Kado. Due to the rock disease, the Higashikatas have developed a long-standing tradition of sacrificing their own life for the preservation of others, a direct reflection of original Josuke's selfless nature and restoration ability. There's no better way to show that Gappy has adopted the Higashikata identity as his own than to perform this morbid tradition. Well, actually there is one way. You see, the stands of the Higashikata family follow a certain naming scheme. 4th generation members like Norisuke have king at the beginning of their name. 5th generation members like Jobin have king after one word or syllable, and 6th generation members like Tsurugi have it after 2 words. These are the rules to the naming convention as we currently understand them, and we can see that even characters adopted into the Higashikata household should have this naming convention. Take for example Mitsuba Higashikata and her stand, Awaking 3 Leaves. Awaking 3 Leaves follows the 5th generational stand naming scheme just like her husband's stand, Speed King. So why is it that Mitsuba's stand follows the naming conventions of the Higashikatas, but Gappy's, and potentially Kado's depending on what her stand name ends up being, doesn't? Well, while Mitsuba seems to have had Awaking 3 Leaves for some time already, our introduction to it happens when Mitsuba suspects that her unborn child was lost in the Rokakaka exchange. This is the moment that she resolves to save them, and as we can see later, she does so by using the Rokakaka to sacrifice her nose in exchange for saving the fetus. Something like a smaller scale but equally valid version of the Higashikata family tradition of self-sacrifice. Despite Mitsuba initially giving the impression that she's shallow and materialistic, you come out of the fight with the feeling that she truly shares the Higashikata's familial values, thus justifying her stand's name. So if Gappy is going to be established as a Higashikata by using the Rokakaka's powers to save Tsurugi, then it makes sense for his stand to undergo some changes as well to adopt the king naming scheme. In fact, it will definitely undergo a change because as we stated prior, Kira's stand matured and granted him the Bites the Dust ability in the original universe. This can happen in a number of ways, but most likely it will happen as a direct consequence of the very same exchange that cures Tsurugi of the rock disease. This means that, like with Soft and Wet obtaining Killer Queen's explosive bubbles, Gappy will obtain an ability, or his stand will transform to resemble Tsurugi's own ability. The ability to manipulate a person's perception of reality. The ability to have people do things without being able to remember doing them. The ability to have other people use their abilities without their knowledge. The ability to turn people into sleeping slaves. Gappy will obtain Tsurugi's ability to skip time. Since the introduction of the Higashikata naming convention, King Crimson has always been the elephant in the room, as aside from talking head of all things, it's the only stand to follow the Higashikata naming scheme outside of JoJolion. Specifically, it follows the same naming convention as the 4th generational Higashikata stands, like Norisuke's King Nothing. You know, Norisuke, the guy we said Gappy was taking the role of. It was obvious that something was going to happen with King Crimson from the naming scheme, especially when you take into consideration that the only original universe stands we've seen in Steel Wall Run and JoJolion are stands used by main antagonists, not to mention that Killer Queen is technically being used by this part's JoJo. And just take a second to think about it. If you were a Rocky and you wanted to foreshadow that a stand would eventually mature into a king, Wouldn't it make sense to have it be associated with the prince? Not only that, but Gappy is essentially a reverse Diavolo. While Diavolo was a single soul that split into two separate souls and would eventually occupy two separate bodies, Gappy is two souls that combined into one soul and occupies one body. So perhaps Gappy isn't even a reimagining of Kira. Perhaps he's a reimagining of both of the villains who are absolutely obsessed with erasing their identity, with Kira just taking precedence due to JoJolion's ties to Diamond is Unbreakable. In any case, that's the Not My Dad arc and the Bites the Dust arc done. Finally, we have the Crazy Diamond is Unbreakable arc, where the final confrontation between Josuke and Kira takes place. Unfortunately, we can't really guess much about how it will go down without a better idea of the limitations of Kado's stand, as well as knowledge of what Gappy is capable of at that point in the story. Now, the following is 99% speculation, but if I had to guess, I would think it's going to be a team deathmatch between a fractured Higashikata family, with Gappy and Kado at the lead on both sides. The Higashikata family has been central to JoJolion since the very first chapter of the part, so giving them and their stands a large-scale battle could end up being a really good means of showing their cooperation and family dynamic. The roster will likely be as follows. On Kado's end, there will likely be 1 to 3 rock humans or rock animals. We need some closure on the Rokakaka trade plot, and if Kado can't provide that on her own, then the rock humans are still probably going to be involved at the conclusion. On Gappy's end, Yasuho is guaranteed to be present. Yasuho has gone through so many trials to aid Gappy in finding his identity, and at this point she's prepared to stick with him to the very end. She also provides a good contrast with Kado and her interactions with Tsurugi. When Kado is placed under a stand attack by Joshu, she responds by attacking him in kind. When Yasuho is placed under a stand attack by Tsurugi, she's furious, but she doesn't lay a finger on him, and she eventually ends up forgiving Tsurugi, handling the situation in a far more mature and motherly way. Kato also likely reminds Yasuho of the issues she has with her own mother. Maybe she can use this battle as a very painful sort of therapy. Rai at this point in the story is likely to not be present. He was destined to die the moment we learned his stand as a dog in JoJo. I'm only half joking here, by the way. Rai cares a lot about self-preservation, and as such he's most likely to develop in the opposite direction, closer to the Higashikata ideals of self-sacrifice. As it stands, I don't see him living through the final battle, but if he does, he'll of course side with Gappy. For the Higashikata children, their allegiance is likely going to change hands quite a bit. Kado will likely manage to temporarily convince them that Gappy is the enemy, but each of them has a decent reason for switching. Daya is already fond of Gappy, and would have reservations about fighting him for a woman she hardly knows, just because that woman is supposedly her mother. In the past, Hado has had people try to take advantage of her, and so I can't imagine she'll let Kado do the same for very long. Joshu is a creep, but he ultimately cares a lot about his family, and having him side with Gappy despite his grievances with him would be a great means of displaying character growth. The biggest wildcards are Jobin, Mitsuba, and Tsurugi. Whichever side these three join, they'll likely join as a group with Jobin acting as their lead. They'll start with Kado, but Mitsuba and Tsurugi will try to convince Jobin to join Gappy and Yasuho. Jobin will be indecisive, as while he does feel beholden to Gappy for curing Tsurugi of the rock disease, he is also extremely loyal to Kado, but eventually, he'll succumb to the wishes of his family and end up siding with Gappy. And that's my theory. So let's return to our original question. Who is Josuke Higashikata? Well, he isn't Giorno, but he kinda is Giorno. But he's also Yoshikage Kira. Yoshikage Kira, Josuke Higashikata, Norisuke Higashikata, Kosaku Kawajiri, Diavolo, and by association Doppio, Tsurugi Higashikata, Hayato Kawajiri, and let's be safe and assume he's also Trish. And that's all there is to it. I mean, come on guys, it's obvious. It's been in front of our faces this whole time. But if I had to put it simply, Josuke Higashikata is a Higashikata, with all the baggage that entails. Thanks for watching. Just like Gappy, this video drew inspiration from many different sources. If you're interested, I recommend checking some of them out. You of course have Shuckmeister's theory on Gappy, which this video was made as a direct response to, but you can also check out Medi's analysis of Kado. It convinced me that Kado would be the main antagonist, as it makes a lot of convincing points that I didn't cover here. There's also X-Fort's analysis of Norisuke's stand, King Nothing, which talks about the significance of the stand's origin and what it means for Norisuke in the future of JoJolion. I recommend giving that one a watch as well.